Our next speaker is Patrick Munoz from University of Chicago, who's going to be talking on Maori personal marking and type-E nouns. Patrick, I hope you are there.
I'm here. Hello.
Good. Hello. I'll give it over to you.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to try to share my screen here. All right, can we see that? Yes, okay. So I'm going to talk today about Maori and a certain marking that appears in the language that's puzzled me for quite some time. So this is stuff that I've done just by looking at the literature on Maori and reference grammars. I don't do field work on this language, and I think that in order to address some of these questions in more detail, you eventually need to do field work, but I kind of have a preliminary hypothesis prepared just based on the kind of basic distribution of this marking, what I think it is. So it's called personal marking. That's kind of a misleading name. The reason it's called that is because you get this marking before proper names of persons in the language, but you also get it elsewhere. So what I'm going to try to convince you of, and also that this is important, is that this is a marker of rigidity in Maori, that Maori has a marker that attends rigidly denoting noun phrases, and hence that Maori noun phrases are type E, right? In general, not just the rigidly denoting ones, but generally. So just a little bit about Maori. Maori is a head initial DP language with a rich set of articles. Its article system is even stricter than the article systems you get in European languages. So it requires overt determiners to the immediate left of noun phrases in many syntactic environments. There are some cases where you can get bare NPs, as I'll show you, but you need articles on lots of stuff, and not just on the usual stuff. You get articles on pronouns, you get articles on question words, and all these kinds of things. And so here is the basic article system in Maori. You have a definite, indefinite split. Te and nga are similar to English the, not quite the same, but similar. He is similar, though not quite the same as English You also have a strong definite and a specific indefinite, and then you have this guy here, this personal article, Oh, sorry, my light's gone off. This personal article is what I'm concerned with. It mirrors stuff you find in lots of European languages, especially in North Germanic languages, that get special marking for certain noun phrases, including names and sometimes also pronouns even, where you have a determiner to the left of them. Maori is interesting because unlike these languages, the marking is highly regular and robust, and there's nothing else in the language that looks like it. So it has a special dedicated category that you just put on things like referential proper names, pronouns, and so on, right? So this personal article, it appears in several environments. There's three major ones and one minor one that I want to set to the side. I think it's not semantically contentive in the latter case, but there's at least three cases where I think it is, and these are all referential noun phrases. So first, for personal pronouns, you get them following the prepositions e, ki, ke, and he. So something morphophonological going on here, I assume, because they all end in e. This is not a weird environment either. Maori is an extremely preposition-heavy language, and pretty much all canonical argument positions besides subject position require prepositions, usually one of these to mark like direct and indirect objects. So basically what this means is pronouns in non-subject position, if they're in argument position, take a marking. So to say, I saw him, you can't say, I saw, yeah, him, you have to say, yeah. And there's really no way to translate this. It's just a bit of stuff you need to say before the pronoun, right? Likewise, you get it with personal names. So personal names, basically in any canonical standard argument position, you get this marking. So neutral subject position or after these same prepositions. So some examples, he is asking Rewi, what is this? You have to say, he is asking Rewi. So it's kind of like saying the Rewi, which you see in a lot of European languages too, but rather than using a definite article again, or something else like a pronoun or demonstrative, which you get in some Germanic languages, you get this special marker. Likewise, in subject position of a predication, hata is in the midst of the potatoes, so you get hata, right? The third environment they appear in is with place names and local nouns. So Maori has morphosyntactically place names and personal names are distinct, And included with the place names are a special closed class of local nouns that mean things like top, bottom, left, behind. And the really odd thing about Maori is that these are not common nouns in Maori. They act like names. So you say things like, in 5 here, I gloss it, the inside is red, but it's important to remember this doesn't mean the, it's something like inside is red, where inside is like a name, right? And I'll show you with complex prepositional phrases, this becomes clearer. And then also place names get this reading too in subject position. So tekau is beyond kaitaya, and you get a tekau, and only subject position for these. So you have, morphosyntactically, you get either a appearing on these things or nothing, as I'll show. And I assume it's a matter of morphosyntax, the way the personal marking appears. And I assume it looks to have the same semantic contribution in each case, namely, it marks these NPs as referential in some way. You never get this on common nouns and so on. There's a minor environment where these appear, as I said, so Maori question words, WH words take articles too, a little bit strange. And the strategy seems to be it just kind of deals them out among the various morphosyntactic categories of the language. So anytime a question word is put into a category that gets a marking, the question word will get it too. So aha, what is just a common noun, but why, who, acts like a personal name, and then hea and nahea act like local nouns or locations. So they inherit the morphological properties, and you can get things like in the question, who made Hata angry? You have to say, why, who made Hata angry? Elsewhere, if they're not in these specific environments, but they still have their referential, rigidly denoting readings, you get zero marking. So here's zero marking on the pronoun rato, which is they. Here's zero marking on hone, which is our name. Here's zero marking on aniwaniwa. Sorry, I have trouble with these Maori names sometimes. And then zero marking on raro, which means below. So it's important to mention here that even though you get zero marking these locations, I think they're still personal marked in the sense that zero marking is personal marking. And what I mean by that is other NPs in these positions, if read, definitely can't get zero marking, right? You have to put some article like te for the in front of them. And so there are some other noun phrases that are zero marked, but they're typically read indefinitely. So definite reading with zero marking or a seems to have the same function, and only pronouns, place names, local nouns, and personal names can get it. So I assume it's a matter of morphosyntax, whether it surfaces as a or nothing, but also null marking is distinctive. And I think that's something common in article languages, right? So I take English to have personal marking too, it's just nothing, and it appears on names, right, when you refer rigidly to them. So the difference between the John versus John, right? The difference is just Maori also happens to have an explicit exponent of this that appears in some environments, which makes it useful for studying these things. You can also see this example here. The dog is eating under the stool. This is an example of where Maori treats the locational noun below, raro, as a kind of name. So what this says is literally, the dog is eating at below, at the stool, where below functions as a kind of name. And that's odd for these kinds of constructions. Maori doesn't use modification or genitives for these locations. And that'll be important in my account of these things later on. So what I assume is that you have, again, a single unified semantic category, at least in these three positions. I think for question words, it's probably semantically null. And what it does is it marks rigidly denoting or referential, if you like, NPs. And then where a versus nothing appears seems to be entirely morphosyntactically conditioned, never semantically. So a simple example of this, if you take 3 indicative sentences saying that Hata shot the pig, same meaning of the name Hata, same event reported, but depending on how you place the noun, you get a versus nothing. So in neutral subject position, a Hata, if you passivize, you're no longer after a preposition ending in I, so you just get Hata alone. The pig was shot by Hata, and then it was Hata who shot the pig, also no marking, because this ko marker is a focus or topicalizing marker. And so Hata is not in canonical subject position and gets no visible marking. So as I said, it's important to remember the zero marking remains distinctive. That is, it's always the expressions that elsewhere can take a that can be zero marked with definite interpretations. Common nouns can't do this. If you want to read them definitely, you have to put a definite article in front of them. And there's only very specific things that can be articleless or without overt articles in Maori. The personal marking seems to form a distinct category in Maori. Certainly morphosyntactically it does. I think that's just beyond dispute from plain reading of the data. But I want to argue semantically it does as well. And I think, the reason I got into this is because I'm interested in the semantics of names and their referential uses. And I think people have not paid enough attention cross-linguistically to how sometimes names get special marking when they're referential. And so for the people who have studied this, which is almost nobody, kind of Ora Matushansky is the only other person who's looked at this. There's been this attempt to reduce marking like to just definite marking, but as a special morphophonological exponent of it. I think that's not right. It looks to me to have a distinct semantic meaning, and it's easiest to show this in Maori, of course, or languages like it. Lots of Polynesian and some other Austronesian languages have this sort of marking. But I think the results generalize to at least other DP languages with article systems. So whether you get nothing or again, will depend on the morphological class of the noun. It'll depend on the syntactic configuration. And then the distribution of personal marking is largely complementary with other articles, which tend to occur with common nouns or things with non-rigid readings. So common nouns never take ever. As I'll show you, modified proper nouns also don't take because the modification introduces a kind of predicative content. The things that take them are, again, pronouns, proper nouns, and local nouns. And these typically, again, unless they're modified, don't take the other regular articles like te, which is the, he, which is and so on in their referential uses. So there's a kind of a split distribution, and they seem to have very distinct semantic roles. And so the question is, what is the semantic contribution of personal marking in Maori? And then cross-linguistically, what is the semantic contribution of kind of rigid or name-like marking in languages more generally? And so the proposal that I'm giving, and it remains preliminary again, because this is just looking at the basic distribution from these reference grammars. I think to cash this out, you would need finer judgments from fieldwork. But my proposal right now is personal marking requires that a noun phrase be rigidly denoting, that is, in the Kripkean sense, referring to an individual invariantly on the world of evaluation. And what I'll say is that Maori referential expressions occupy NP, all of them. So Maori does not really have any noun phrases that can't take articles except for simplex demonstratives. That's kind of the only case. Everything else takes articles and seems to occupy the NP position. So what we're going to do, following a recent proposal by Peter Laserson, is treat all noun phrases as type E, and then distinguish among rigid and non-rigid referential expressions. And the basic idea is that typologically, the kind of article you get not only tracks distinctions we're familiar with, right, with things like definite versus indefinite, the kind of discourse reference, whether it's anaphoric or not, that kind of stuff, but also this other thing, whether the reference is rigid or not, which I take to correspond also to a kind of discourse status, right? But something like, determined independent of the possibility of modification, hooking onto the actual world or the world of the context, versus subject to modification and intentional environments. So hooking onto the world of evaluation instead. So there's a split not only between indefinite and indefinite in Maori, but also between rigid and non-rigid is the idea. So some possible treatments you could do of this article. And again, not many people have looked at this. I'm going to talk a little bit about Matushansky, who's made a proposal, why I think that these are not appealing, and also why I think you should give a semantic explanation for this. So to begin, you could say, well, there's no real interesting semantics here. It's just a bit of morphosyntactic junk. Or the there's a morphophonological variant of the definite article that's sometimes spelled out as in Maori, maybe as nothing in English, when you have things like referential proper names. So this is what Madushansky essentially says. She says the personal article is just a normal definite article that by some morphophonological means has been spelled out differently. So she says it undergoes an obligatory morphophonological operation in the presence of a plus proper feature. Crucially, this depends on languages having a plus proper feature in their nouns. I think that this is right. If you look cross-linguistically, proper nouns often have different morphological features from other nouns. And in fact, like in Maori, place names and people names don't even behave the same, right? So there's very fine-grained morphological features here. And the Austronesian languages in particular are languages that more robustly than any in the world that I'm aware of seem to have a proper common distinction morphologically, right? So that I think is fine. What I don't think is right is I don't think that you can reduce the function of a to just tracking this kind of proper feature. In other words, I think proper nouns have special semantics, and I think that a tracks those semantics. So the idea, presumably in Maori, a would surface elsewhere as te. In other environments, it's just the, but contracted or changed somehow. So how would you do this? Well, here are a couple things I think you can't say. These are like the absolute minimum that you'd have to say, right? It's just, well, maybe the personal article is just a definite, but it selects for proper nouns, right? So some nouns are marked proper. A definite marking that selects for proper spells out as a or as nothing, as opposed to te. You also might think it's an agreement relation. So you have a trivial probe-goal relation between the determiner and the noun, and it gets valued for a proper feature that has morphophonological effects. You know, hand wave, something happens, and the definite spells out as a. You might also think this is just a result of some kind of entity head movement, which a lot of people posit for various European languages to explain the behaviors of definite marking in noun phrases and null marking in a lot of DPs. So you have a Maori name like Ponga, it moves to the determiner slot, and somehow, again, hand waving, there's morphophonological effects that cause a different spell out of this article-like thing. I don't think any of this is going to work. Very appealing, of course, to take the kind of simplest solution, but the reason I don't think it works is that there's a big, well, first off, there's a problem with just these proposals by themselves, which is one of the most puzzling facts about this kind of marking is that restrictive modification on the noun phrase blocks it. So the generalization is, and this is not just in Maori, it's in every language that does this that I'm aware of. And I'll show you some other examples. If you restrictively modify the noun phrase, you have to go back to the regular marking and use the instead of things like a. So restrictive modification voids personal marking, requiring marking typical of common nouns as opposed to proper nouns instead. And none of these mechanisms, head movement, agreement, selection, should be blocked by adjunction or by restrictive modification, and neither should their morphophonological effects, right? So for example, in Maori, if you modify your name with a restrictive modification with something like a relative clause, so something like e korero ne ka kore roa, the hone I'm talking about, so the restrictive relative clause ends here, and then the other independent clause is not tall is here, so it means the hone I'm talking about isn't tall, where the interpretation is not, there's some guy named Hone I'm referring to, but I modify the name, and Hone means something like property of being named Hone, right? And you modify it to mean this is the Hone that I'm talking about. You have to use te, you can't use a here, right? And this is specifically something having to do with restrictive modification. So the judgments that Bauer reports in his, I believe, reference grammar is that when the modification is read as non-restrictive, speakers sometimes allow the modification, but when it's read as restrictive, they don't. So first, if you give them a scenario where restrictive modification is more likely, the judgments worsen, versus a scenario where non-restrictive is more likely, the judgments get better. And then if you suggest the restrictive versus non-restrictive readings to the speaker in elicitation, they'll reject the restrictive one, but not the non-restrictive one, right? So if you try to say something like this, so hone here is marked personally with a null marking in focus position, this means it's trying to say something like, hone that is coming to stay is the eldest, and that's just bad. It's also bad in English usually, right? You have to say something like the hone that is coming to stay. It's the same thing, right? But if you read it non-restrictively, hone, who is coming to stay, is the eldest, that's fine. Likewise, if you give the informant a situation where you only expect there to be one hone, and so restrictive modification is not pragmatically licensed because there's nothing to compare him to, and you say something like, the story returns to Hotu, who had dived for the anchor of their canoe. Here you have the personal marking on ahotu, and the relative clause is fine there, but only read non-restrictively. So Maori does not distinguish between restrictive and non-restrictive relative clauses formally, but in the judgments, restrictive truth conditions are bad with personal marking. And this is not a quirk of Maori. This is in every language I'm aware of that does this has the very same pattern. I'd be interested to know if there are counterexamples, but this has been mentioned, for example, in Catalan and Icelandic. So Catalan has something like Maori. It's not quite the same, where in certain environments, proper names get special marking if they're referential, which is not like the normal definite article. But the regular definite article reappears if you modify the name. So if you say something like the Paul that we met at the party, and this has to mean the individual named Paul that we met at the party. Likewise for Icelandic, Icelandic has special marking in front of certain proper names that looks like a demonstrative or a pronoun. So you say things like she Maria to mean Maria in certain environments. But here you don't say that, you say the Maria. If you modify it with the clause who I get to know, so if the reading is you are the first Maria I get to know, or gotten to know, I guess, then you have to use the and not the special personal marking, right? So Madushansky is aware of this, and she proposes a solution, which is she wants for there to be a morphological operation called M-merger, which merges the determiner and the noun together, and in such a local way that a junction stops it. So there has to be a direct relationship between two heads with no intervening structure, and therefore any modification will break this up. So her proposal is that lots of languages require you to morphologically merge the determiner and noun, and this will result in null marking in lots of languages like English, and then in languages like Maori, it will result in a special personal article instead. And the way the operation is defined, modification will break that up. So that's supposed to solve the modification problem. This account still doesn't work, in my opinion, for two big reasons that I don't see a solution to. One is that it's based on an incorrect generalization, which is that this contraction of the article into the noun phrase is not obligatory in most of these languages. I don't know about Maori. I haven't found an example of that, but in all the other languages this is supposed to account for. It doesn't seem to be right. So, for example, as Jeshin has pointed out, in English, noun phrases like John and the John actually both exist, and they mean different things, you know. So, you know, if you say, I need you to find somebody named John and somebody named Mary, and you say, I found them, you can say, like, which one? Did you find the John or did you find the Mary, right? And that doesn't mean the same thing as did you find John or did you find Mary? And an account like this predicts here the article would obligatorily contract into nothing, and that's not right. So there's a basic distributional problem. The larger problem, though, in my opinion, is semantic, which is that personal marked DPs just aren't definite descriptions. I mean, they're just not. And people have been trying to make this account work for 15 years. I don't think it's worked. I won't get into it here, but you know, personal marked DPs, like proper names used referentially, they have distinct rigidity behavior in intentional environments. They have distinct potential for covariant readings beneath quantifiers. They license and aphora differently. Even if you somehow solve all the morphological problems, this account is just not appealing because the basic semantics are not right. So in other words, personal marking and regular definite marking look different and they semantically act different. So the hypothesis is, well, why aren't they different, right? That's kind of what I'm asking. And I think similar problems arise for any account that tries to make personal marking just a special realization of normal definiteness for morphosyntactic reasons. So I would like to try to motivate a semantically based account. And I'll give you two proposals that I think are quite intuitive and obvious that you might want to try, and suggest why I don't like them or don't think they're going to work. So one is that A just marks referential expressions. So we can just cast it as a kind of type marker. It composes with type E things and returns the very same thing. So it's a null marking that combines only with referential expressions. So it denotes an identity function on individuals, let's say, and where composition is successful, there's no non-trivial contribution of the article. So it just takes an individual and gives it right back. So take your standard account of names or pronouns. If a name is just a constant, the personal name ponga denotes ponga, and then a will just give you ponga back. Likewise with ya, which is he or she, you get back whatever the variable gives you, right? That will mean there's no composition with common nouns if you take them to be of a different type. So if they're some kind of predicative type, let's say et, like fare, house, this will result in type mismatch. They can't compose. And so you have an explanation of its distribution, right? It occurs with referential expressions, but not common nouns, just for typing reasons. So it's a kind of E-type marker, if you like. This is pretty elegant and simple, but the problem is, number one, it requires you to say that NPs are type heterogeneous in Maori. Some have to be E, some have to be ET. That's kind of a theory internal concern. It depends on what you think the mapping between syntactic and semantic categories is. But if you want NP to be homogeneous, you can't say that, right? The other problem is that names are not exclusively referential, not in Maori, and actually not really in any language that I'm aware of. They also have predicate-looking uses. And this has been a huge cause for concern for lots of accounts of names. So in other words, a name like Hone does not always just refer to some guy named Hone. It often means, as if it denotes a property, person named Hone, and can be modified and so on. So there's two environments in Maori where this happens that I'm aware of. I suspect there are more, but languages differ in where they can use predicative names. Not all of them are as free as every other, but Maori uses, first off, like we saw before, restrictive relative clauses. So that's the Hone I was talking about, where Hone here seems to mean guy named Hone, right? And then also with genitives. So you can say, my Hone is useless, meaning not like, oh, Hone, my Hone, he's such a useless guy. No, but restrictively, right? The guy named Hone, that's mine, is useless, right? So if that's true, you're going to have to make names type heterogeneous too, because sometimes they're type E and take a, and then sometimes they're type E and take te. Now, some people have actually proposed this, that names occur both as type E and type ET. The problem is the mechanisms that they posit in order to do this are not cross-linguistically plausible. They rely on either some morphological mechanism converting one into the other, and such mechanisms, as far as I know, don't exist. So as far as I know, there's no overt marker in any language. I'd be interested to know if somebody knows about one that converts a referential name into a predicate one. They always just seem to look the same. There's no morphological exponent of a shift between these categories. And if you do something else like a type shift, you can do that. You know, in semantics, you can kind of do whatever you want, you know, define an operator, go to town. The problem is that these operations are ad hoc as far as I know. That is, if you actually spell out what they have to do, they're basically only used for names for this one purpose, which to me seems like a redescription of the data, not an interesting generalization. So I don't think that's promising. I don't think the type ambiguity of names is a good way to go. I'm going to suggest that they're all type E. The difference between referential names and predicative names is just whether they're read rigidly or not, as we'll see in the variables that they introduce. A third kind of account you might try is one that I proposed a couple years ago that I'm kind of not too happy with anymore. The idea is that Maori a and other proprial marking in different languages, or personal marking, is a kind of rigidifier. So it's like a definite, except that it rigidifies the predicate and makes it true of the individual at the world of the context as opposed to evaluation. So I propose a denotation for a like this. It's more complicated than this, but this is the basic idea. You take the intension of a property and you have a Straussonian definite, but it plugs in the actual world. So it means give me back the uniquely relevant individual who has that property at the world of the context, right? So how would this work with things like names? Well, you say names are always type E in the lexicon. They denote the property of bearing the name. So ponga is just a noun, and it is true of pongas, right? True of people named ponga. So ponga is going to denote the property of being named ponga. A ponga will give you back the unique individual named ponga in the context, so it will refer to some contextually relevant ponga. The problem with this account is that it requires an explanation, and I think a semantic explanation for why a does not occur with common nouns. So why don't you get things like afare, that means house, as if it were a name, right? Like I'm going to house, like I'm going home or something. That doesn't really happen. I don't think there's a good morphological explanation for this. I think it has to be a semantic one. I propose such an explanation, basically saying that the way that a works, it can only combine with name-like semantics. But I don't think that's right. This causes problems with quasi-names like mom, which can be used rigidly as names, mom, or like common nouns, you know, a mom, the mom, whatever. You can make it work, but you have to make unattractive stipulations that make it look like the semantics is not going in the right direction. The other thing is, if you want to do this, you have to remember these articles appear on pronouns in Maori, right? Which means pronouns have to be predicates. And you can do that if you want to, but it's a serious commitment. You'd have to make things, you know, I would have to mean speaker or something, and then a would rigidify it to refer to the speaker in context. There's no predicative uses of pronouns that I'm really aware of in Maori. So the issue is, I think there is something right about a and similar articles being markers of rigidity, but rather than rigidifiers, I take them to be markers of a pre-existent rigidity on the noun. And so a will introduce a presupposition that the noun is rigid. So very briefly, the implementation of this, I'm following Laserson's recent proposal to this effect. You can look at the paper if you want the details. I'll simplify it here. But he proposes that all nouns are of type E, and they all introduce variables. There are technical reasons for this, but there's also a typological reason, which is the interesting one to me, which is that cross-linguistically, predicative nouns actually seem to be more marked than referential ones, right? And so he thinks you ought to take the baseline as type E. Very, very appealing for Maori because everything is in NP position, maybe except demonstratives, and then that includes pronouns and names and classically type E expressions, right? So what you do on this kind of approach is you say all common nouns are given indices and they're interpreted as property restricted, non-rigid variables. So variables differ by world. We're gonna have assignment functions. They map not indices, but pairs of worlds and indices to individuals. Every noun is given an index, and we say for any noun indexed with an index, it just gives you back the variable at the world. So you can then govern the nouns with lexical postulates saying things like, if an index is given to fare, house, the variable it introduces has to be a house at the relevant world. So here would be a denotation for fare, house. It's just a house. It just refers to some contextually relevant house. That must be a house at the world of evaluation. Again, appealing for Maori, not only because everything seems to be an NP position that's type E, but also because predication in Maori has to be overtly marked. So if you want to say he is a teacher, you need this predicate marker he, right? And so that suggests that predicative nouns are actually derived. So on such a system, I won't go, in the interest of time, I won't go through this too carefully, but the idea is what articles do, instead of converting properties into individuals, they just introduce restrictions on the variables. So a definite article like te would make it definite, spell out definiteness however you like in your favorite theory. You can make it Straussonian by saying, you know, any two assignments map to the same individual at the world, meaning there's only one relevant individual with that property. So if you say te fare, it would mean something like the Straussonian uniquely relevant house. You then get predicates by having the predicate marker operate on the variable and saying, well, there's some assignment, you know, give back the property of there being some assignment that maps to that individual at the world, which is going to get you things like he fare, meaning the property of being a house, right? There's no real formal problem with treating nouns as type E. You just kind of reverse the order of composition, right? Now, what we want to do to add to this system is make a marker of rigidity. So we need to introduce rigid variables as well as non-rigid ones. So what we'll say is that we evaluate our expressions with respect to the world of the context, the world of evaluation and assignment, and we make it intentions abstract over the evaluation world, but not the context world, right? Then we can have two sets of variables, one rigid, one non-rigid. We can say that common nouns get the non-rigid variables, pronouns and traces get the rigid variables. Names, importantly, will not have any special restrictions, as well as words like mom. They can get rigid variables or non-rigid ones. And then we say, the non-rigid variables are interpreted relative to the world of evaluation. So modal operators can operate on them and so forth. And then rigid ones anchor directly to the world of the context. So with a pronoun like ao, it's going to target the speaker at the world of the context, but it will just be a variable of type E that refers to that speaker. And then you can combine things like ao as well as names, as we'll show, with the marker a, which marks the variable as rigid. So it takes the intention of the variable, adds a presupposition that it's rigid, and just gives it right back. So again, it has no real substantive semantic contribution, but the presupposition it introduces ensures that the variable it combines with is rigid. So if it tries to combine with something non-rigid, that's not going to work. And then we cache out rigidity. There's a lot of ways you can cache it out, but the kind of Kripkean way of doing it would just be to say, for any two worlds at the same assignment, the variable maps the same individual at every world on that assignment, right? So briefly, how it will work. First, a can appear with pronouns because they're always rigid. So if we have a pronoun like ya, he or she, that's going to give us some individual back at the world of the context. A will combine with this, make sure it's rigid, and the composition will go through. Why? Because the variable represented by ya, or its intention, will be the same at every world because it's not sensitive to the world of evaluation, right? So for any two worlds and assignment, plugging in that world and assignment into the variable gets you the same thing for every world, namely just that individual you started with. So it's rigid, and a composes with it. A cannot compose with common nouns because they're never rigid. They always introduce non-rigid indices. So for something like afare, you don't get this as like a name for house. The composition will fail. So you have fare here, introducing the non-rigid variable. The presupposition that it's rigid will then cause the composition to crash. You get undefined. We know that fare is a non-rigid variable because if you plug in two worlds, W and W prime, into the variable at the same assignment, you'll get at least one world where they don't match up. And that would namely be a world where one individual is different from the other across these two worlds, or rather the assignment maps to different individuals at those two worlds, both of which would have to be houses, right? Different houses across the worlds. So the interesting part then comes with names. Remember, there's no restriction on names. They can be rigid or non-rigid. And I think this is correct cross-linguistically. Names are special and that they have no special restriction on whether they're rigid or not. With the caveat that non-rigid names are, let's say, pragmatically marked. They need special discourse considerations to introduce them, but I think the grammar generates them just fine. Whereas names like mom, let's say, are not pragmatically marked. Mom can just be rigid or not, however you want to say it. And this is an intrinsic feature of the noun, so we don't expect any morphological exponent of it. And I think that there aren't any. So you can have a name that is either a rigid variable or a non-rigid one. These will be tracked by name-bearing properties, namely being named as that individual. So your non-rigid name will be a variable that's given that name, the individual in the world of evaluation. So you get someone who's named Ponga in W, and then the rigid name will be somebody named Ponga in the world of the context. So this is the more common use of the name, but this exists as well. So if they're rigid, they compose just fine, like above, the presupposition is met. But when they're non-rigid, the composition isn't possible for the same reasons as above. So one reason this is interesting is because it gives us a semantic explanation for why restrictive modification voids personal marking. Namely, modification introduces world sensitivity, right? Because modification has predicates in it that are, or the equivalent of predicates that are modally non-rigid. So if you modify hone with a relative clause like ikorero nao ao, you can't get a in front of that because the variable is no longer rigid. Even if hone was, the entire thing will be non-rigid due to the contribution of the relative clause. Lots of ways you could treat modification. Here's one way to do it. Take a variable and introduce a presupposition on that variable to the effect that the individual it maps to is the one being talked about at that world or whatever property. And importantly here, you introduce the world of evaluation, right? And that sensitivity to the world of evaluation is going to block the personal marking. So if you have hone indexed with a rigid variable j modified by ikorero now ao, you get something like this. It's a variable that refers to an individual named hone in the context that's presupposed to be talked about at the world of evaluation. Now, when that happens, is not going to compose because this is a non-rigid variable. There are two worlds such that these don't match up. Namely, there could be a world where the individual is named hone at the world of the context, but in the two different worlds of evaluation, it's two distinct individuals that are actually named hone at the world of context that are being talked about in those distinct worlds. So composition with will fail. No personal marking for any modified noun phrase. But composition with another article that has no rigidity requirement, like te, will succeed if you have a non-rigid name. So you can get something like te hone indexed with a non-rigid variable to mean the uniquely relevant individual in W, the world of evaluation, named hone that the speaker was talking about. Finally, we have with local nouns. If you treat roto again as a kind of name that just means inside, there's no problem for just simplex uses of these. So when you say inside is red, that rigidly refers to something that is the inside of something else. You could say it's the inside of some contextually relevant individual, maybe make it a function that takes another argument for that individual that's also rigid, and everything works out fine. Roto variables would always be rigid, and they're restricted by having to be the inside of something at the world of the context. But you might wonder what happens with complex prepositional phrases, like we saw in example 10, the dog beneath the stool, raro I teturu. If the dog is eating beneath the stool, you might think that this modifies beneath, and then therefore we introduce modification, and so non-rigidity like above, and so why do we get this kind of rigid marking? So however you want to analyze this, you might say it's a relational noun. It takes the stool as one of its relata. Maybe it's some kind of modifying PP. Maybe it's a genitive of some sort. That should introduce non-rigidity in the variable through the common noun turu, and then personal marking should not be allowed. Contrary to what we see, there is personal marking. So what do we say about this? What I want to say, this is somewhat of a speculation, but what I want to say is that in these complex prepositional phrases in Maori, you don't get modification or genitives between below and stool. What you have instead are just parallel adjuncts to the verb that stack one after the other. So if you look at a Maori phrase like iraro I teturu, what that literally means is at, below, at the stool. In other words, from the flat structure, you cannot see any subordination of one to the other, which means it's possible that these are just parallel adjuncts, both of which modify the verb like eat, right? So instead of the structure being like this, kai iraro I teturu, eat at, bottom at the stool, where raro is modified somehow, however you want to do it by at the stool, you get something like this. And so what it literally means is eat at bottom at the stool, where bottom just rigidly denotes some location, and then at the stool also modifies eat. So it'd be like saying, I'm giving this talk in my room at my apartment or something, where there's just two flat PPs, but then interpreted together, the most reasonable reading is it's the bottom of the stool, right? So in a kind of quasi-English, you gloss this as not the dog is eating at the bottom of the stool, modifying eating, with of the stool modifying bottom, but rather the dog is eating at bottom, modifying eating, at the stool, modifying eating. If that's so, then you can say that things like bottom are still rigidly referring, and so get the a marking. So this depends on the prevalence of PP adjuncts in Maori as verbal modifiers as opposed to nominal modifiers. If they typically only appear as verbal modifiers, this position is much stronger. There might also be subtle semantic differences predicted in a flat structure versus a hierarchical one. I'm not quite sure what those would be. I'd have to think about it, but if you could find truth conditional differences, you might be able to test this. But I think what's kind of exciting about this hypothesis is that you might have an actual explanation for why local nouns are so weird in Maori. That is, why do they look so much like names? Well, it's precisely because Maori doesn't use genitives for locations. And Maori has perfectly good genitives it could use. It just doesn't use them. Instead, it's something that looks like it could be flat parallel adjuncts with things like raro beneath just being like names, right, that refer rigidly. Hence why they receive their personal marking. One last thing, I'll end here and leave the predictions for the questions, but you also might want to say, because you don't get things like te ao, the me, or te ponga, the ponga for a rigid name, you should get it non-rigidly, which we can talk about if you want, or te raro, the bottom. Articles like te would then mark non-rigidity as well. So what I'm suggesting is that the article system of Maori has not only kind of an indefinite, definite contrast, but a rigid, non-rigid contrast, right? And so you can add non-rigidity to the conditions on te and cash out non-rigidity as just, at two worlds, the things differ. So that's the account in a nutshell. I hope that this does not just apply to Maori, but to any rich article system where you get some kind of special marking for things like names. And that will be it for me. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much. We have about 15 minutes for questions. So let's start with Avi Schoenfeld.
Chris, you can go first. I didn't raise my hand.
Oh, okay, Chris Davis, let's go to you.
Okay, sorry, I try not to be first, but now I'm first. Thanks for the interesting talk. I guess one quick comment and a question. So the quick comment is your 3.4, it struck me that maybe an alternative to lexically encoding non-rigidity would be to, if it's something like a presupposition in the other case, then you could use something like a maximized presupposition story. That's just a thing that occurred to me. But my question was, with your flat PP, the speculation about the location, yeah, these guys, one immediate question that came up to me is, if your proposal about it being basically like a flat VP modification structure or something, shouldn't you expect there wouldn't be a ordering requirement? And at least the examples that you cited always have the stool coming after bottom and so on, which, if there was some kind of syntactic compositional process where at the stool is modifying bottom in some sense, you see what I mean? Then you shouldn't be able to reverse them. And I don't know what the corpus, what your examples suggest, but at least the ones you showed always had it, I think, with the bottom type word first, and the thing which is being specified, the bottom of which is to the right. So if you have the flat structure, if that's a real asymmetry, and maybe you'd have to do field work to confirm it, I don't know, but then I would be surprised by that asymmetry. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, so I think that is correct, that you usually get the one involving the local noun to the left if it's complex, and the other one to the right. They're not all adjuncts can be freely moved in their linear order. So I don't, if you have some independent reason to believe that these adjuncts had to be in a certain order, I mean, certainly semantically they could be, right? But there are other restrictions on the ordering of adjuncts. So you're right, though. I guess I would be committed to there being some other reason other than the compositional semantics that the adjuncts have to be ordered in that way.
Right.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, I guess I also worry might not be the right word, but it occurred to me that you might also underspecify the semantics by having the flat structure. Like, your analogy of, at my computer at my house. Well, the computer has to be somehow in the house because of the way the world works. But you could imagine there being some relevant, you're at the bottom of something and also at the stool in some sense. I mean, maybe it's kind of weird, but like the cat could be on the stool under the table or at the bottom of the table or something. You see what I mean? And so if you're doing independent modification, then whatever happens with bottom when you don't have an additional specifier, like it's just a contextually understood bottom of something or inside of something, it struck me that if you have the flat structure, you should in principle be able to do the same thing, like inside the contextually specified object at the stool or something like that. You see what I mean? So that's anyway, I don't mean to go off on this thing, but I just get concerned about like how that
Well,
would
no,
be-
I agree. And I don't think it's a concern. I think it's a prediction. It might be a bad prediction, but that would be the sort of edge case where you'd want to see, is it possible if these are only flat, that kind of reading should in principle always be available, even if it's not the most pragmatically salient one, right? But yeah, you'd want to see whether that's so. I mean, but you get these ambiguities even in languages that subordinate with the prepositional phrases like English. You know,
Mm.
I'm at my computer in my apartment can be read as in my apartment modifies computer, but it can also be read flat. And typically those readings can't really be told apart because usually for your world knowledge, what's the difference, right? But you could think of situations where they come apart. The weird thing about the Maori then would be you expect an obligatory flat reading on this proposal, right?
Yeah.
But no, I agree. So if that weren't so, if I'm wrong about this and the Maori really does use more traditional prepositional structures for these locative things, I would have to rethink this because it's not clear to me how you get rigid reference to things like bottom. So in a way, I like the hypothesis for that reason, that I think it's exciting in the sense that if this is correct, you would have a possible explanation for this weird thing about Maori, which is it seems to think of locations like below and left as names, not as predicates that can be modified with subordinate things, right?
Yeah.
But I just, without field work, I don't think you can do that. So
Yeah, no, I mean, that would be a cool place to go forward with field work. It also just strikes me that incidentally, if the reverse order is possible,
yeah, right.
You can get what I'm about to say. Like you could imagine that would force the flat structure, even if the embedded structure. So you would predict if the reverse order is possible, there shouldn't be any relevant difference in the semantics, if it's some tactic. But anyway, I'll stop hitting that horse and let the next person.
Yeah. No, thanks. Yeah.
So thank you.
Yeah.
That was great talk. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, Aviv, are we ready?
Yes. Do you know if personal pronouns are compatible with modified names where modification maintains rigidity? This might be like an individual level adjective like handsome, handsome ponga.
What reading do you intend there? Do you mean like so like
it's like part of his name, like
oh right yeah. So
handsome ponga.
That I don't know. I haven't seen examples like that. That should be fine because that would be just kind of like a non-restrictive modification. So handsome Jack or whatever, right, is a kind of there's Jack and he is handsome. But you should expect on this picture that adjectives restrictively modify names, and then you should get things like the handsome Jack as opposed to the non-handsome one. But you shouldn't get handsome Jack that's restrictively modified. And I'm not sure about this. The judgments for English speakers on this vary. For example, I want to talk to handsome Jack, not to ugly Jack or something. But there's another reading that you actually predict that's possible with the definite article, which is like the handsome Jack, meaning not the handsome guy named Jack, but the handsome person who's identical to Jack, if there are multiple instances of the same individual, right? Like across time, like the handsome Jack is in his 20s, the not handsome Jack is in his 50s, whatever, I don't know. And I predict that and I think it does happen in English. I have no idea if it happens in Maori, but that is what I predict, that should happen cross-linguistically, right? There should be a distinction between names that are rigid, become non-rigid through modification, and then get a definite, versus names that are already non-rigid, stay non-rigid through modification and get a definite. Right. But with the cases like the handsome John or whatever, I have to predict that where those get personal marking, they can only be read non-restrictively. That's what I predict.
Right,
yeah.
Right. Okay,
which I'm not sure is right. Yeah, which I'm not sure is right even in English, because the judgments vary on that. But yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, Toshi Ogihara.
Thank you very much for an interesting talk. I have one question. So does this work only with singular expressions? Is it possible for you to use this in conjunction with names of plural entities or conjoined expressions like John and Mary?
You wouldn't really be able to tell in Maori. So Maori has no morphological plural. And then for conjunction, it has to use a special. So for conjunction, you don't do it like in English. It's not just like John and Mary. You have to do like a special additional thing where you use the particle ko for each addition of the conjunct. So I'm not sure if conjunction semantics works the same way. Yeah, so there is no morphological plural in Maori. You do get plural marking on a restricted set of like 8 common nouns have plurals. And then there's a plural singular distinction in the other articles, but not in the personal article.
How about pronouns? Do they have plural?
Yeah.
Pronouns?
Yeah, plural
Can
pronouns.
you use
And
a in front of it?
you have
Yeah?
to.
Oh,
You
okay.
have to in the right circumstances, yes.
And if I may, so this is optional, right? Even if the name is used rigid as a rigid designator, correct?
No, it's obligatory.
It's obligatory.
Well, I'll put it this way: judging by the syntactic environment, it is utterly predictable. You will either get a or nothing,
Oh,
and
okay.
that's totally obligatory. There are languages where this kind of stuff is optional, like in Scandinavian languages, in which case the personal article tends to imply that you know the person or something like this. That's not in Maori. In Maori, it doesn't matter if you know them or not. It's totally syntactically determined. And if you think both the null and the a are personal marking, then yes, everything's personally marked. No getting around it. Yeah.
But you said null marking is possible.
The null marking is possible, but I take null marking to be personal marking in the sense that other nouns that don't take a cannot be null marked in those environments if they're read definitely. So in the same way that, for example, in English, the house versus John, I take John, the fact that it has no determiner, to be a kind of marking of the fact that it's a proper name, because you can't just say house, you know. That.
Okay, thank you.
So if you read it that way, then yes, personal marking is always obligatory for all of these kinds of expressions.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and take the last question for myself, since I don't see any other hands raised, and I'll squeeze in before that happens. It has to do with the question of bound pronouns. Have you looked at the bound variables, and in particular, behavior of bound pronouns versus bound definite descriptions and demonstratives? So the sentence, every prisoner claims he is innocent, can also be revised as every prisoner claims the prisoner is innocent, or every prisoner claims that prisoner is innocent. And variables have been at least held up as your prototypical rigid expression in at least some analyses. This would suggest that something like the prisoner might be able to be interpreted rigidly. Would you ever get an in that kind of a situation with prisoner? Or is there a different way of doing bound variables that allows them to still be non-rigid?
So I don't know, but I doubt you would in that case. I doubt you would get personal marking on common nouns anywhere. What you do get is, so Maori does have variable-like expressions that receive personal marking. But that happens because they're pronouns. So for example, one strategy of relativization in Maori involves resumptive pronouns. And the resumptive pronouns, if read as variables, do get personal marking. There's another construction in Maori so this is another really weird thing about Maori. It seems to have an expression that's literally just a variable. It seems to be literally a pronounced trace. So in some relativized environments, you have this marker that appears nowhere else in the language, only in the spot where a gap would be. So it seems to pronounce gaps. The problem is that you can't tell if that's personal marked because it's not of the right morphosyntactic type. And so it always just appears bare. I don't know what that means, right? If it's just always bear, I can't tell. If it had elsewhere, you could say, yeah, there's a variable that takes but it just never appears. I think it never appears with any marking, right? Yeah, and as for pronouns that are like read as bound variables in traditional bound variable readings, I would have to check, but I suspect, yeah, I suspect that they would, as long as they're pronouns. I don't think like with the prisoner, although I'm not sure that a bound reading of the prisoner should be rigid.
Yeah, I'm not sure either, but I think it's an interesting question to ask, and this would be a language that, if you're right, would show morphologically whether bound variables are always rigid or whether you really want to have a distinction between bound rigid variables and bound non-rigid variables.
Yeah, so I would be delighted if something happened where, like, in a quantified structure where like a pronoun could be used non-rigidly under quantification if te started appearing, or if like somehow you got a rigid variable with a common noun and started appearing. I don't know if that's going to happen though, because my suspicion is these things are governed by a morphosyntactic property of plus proper, which only appears on, you know, in the right noun class too. But
Right.
yeah.
Okay, that's the time we have for this session.